What would you do if one day, on your way home, your entire life was turned upside down in a matter of seconds? What if everything you thought about safety, justice, and fairness was shattered? It was a late Tuesday evening, and the air was crisp with the first hints of autumn. Dr. Serena Walker, a respected OB/GYN, was driving home after a long day. She had just left a charity event where she spoke passionately about improving maternal health care for women of color. Her mind was racing with thoughts about how far her work had come and how much more there was to do. As she pulled into a quiet gas station, the last thing on her mind was danger. But within moments, flashing police lights illuminated the station, and two officers approached her car with suspicion in their eyes. "Excuse me, ma'am, step out of the vehicle," one officer demanded. Confused but compliant, Serena tried to explain who she was. She was 8 months pregnant after all, and posed no threat. But her words fell on deaf ears. What happened next was something Serena never imagined. She was violently forced to the ground, handcuffed, and treated like a criminal. In that moment, she feared not only for her life, but for the life of her unborn child. What could possibly lead to such an encounter? Why was Serena, a woman who had dedicated her life to saving others, suddenly the victim of this senseless violence? Little did she know, this was no random incident. The truth behind what happened to Serena would soon unravel, exposing a much larger, more dangerous reality, one that went far beyond a simple traffic stop. The night stretched long, wrapping the quiet suburban streets in a blanket of stillness. The northern neighborhood, known for its sprawling estates and towering oak trees, sat in stark contrast to the rest of the city. Dr. Serena Walker drove carefully down these unfamiliar roads, her hands steady on the steering wheel despite her exhaustion. The dim glow of streetlights flickered against the windshield of her modest sedan, reflecting her equally understated presence in this part of town. Serena wasn't a stranger to long days. Her career as an OB/GYN was demanding, and her passion for maternal health advocacy meant her schedule was often packed with events like the one she had just left. A fundraiser for her charity dedicated to improving maternal care for women of color. The success of the night had left her with a feeling of accomplishment. But now, 8 months pregnant, the weight of both her body and her responsibilities pressed down on her with relentless force. As she navigated the winding streets, Serena glanced at the dashboard and realized that her gas gauge was nearly empty. With a small sigh, she spotted a gas station up ahead. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow across the pavement, but it was open, and that was all that mattered. Serena turned into the station, carefully pulling her car up beside the gas pump. She stepped out of the car, her hand instinctively resting on her swollen belly, as she moved with the cautious grace of someone acutely aware of her body's limits. The cool night air was refreshing against her skin, and for a brief moment she savored the quiet. The streets were empty, and the gas station, though slightly run down, was a welcome pit stop. Serena reached for her wallet, her movements slow but practiced, preparing to pay for the gas. Unbeknownst to her, a police patrol car had pulled into the station just moments after she did. Inside, two officers, Adams and Mitchell, watched her with narrowed eyes. "That car looks too nice for someone like her," Officer Adams muttered, his voice carrying a quiet but unmistakable edge of suspicion. Officer Mitchell nodded in agreement, his eyes locked on Serena as she moved around the car. "Yeah, she doesn't look like she belongs here. Let's check it out." The two officers were seasoned veterans in their precinct, patrolling the wealthier areas of the city. Over the years, their biases had hardened into habits. Their encounters with people of color in predominantly white neighborhoods always casting a shadow of doubt in their minds. In their eyes, Serena wasn't just an ordinary woman stopping for gas. She was out of place, and that alone was enough reason for them to act. Adams turned on the patrol car's lights, the sudden flash of blue and red breaking the stillness of the night. The loud blare of the siren startled Serena, and she froze for a moment, her heart quickening with both surprise and a rising sense of unease. She turned to see the patrol car pulling up behind her, its lights bathing the gas station in a harsh, unforgiving glow. Instinctively, Serena raised her hands slightly in the air, signaling her compliance. She had been raised to be cautious around law enforcement, especially as a black woman. Despite her professional success and personal achievements, the lessons of systemic racism were ingrained in her. She knew all too well how easily situations like this could spiral out of control. "Is there a problem, officer?" Serena called out, her voice steady but with a tinge of nervousness. Officer Adams stepped out of the patrol car first, his hand already resting on his gun holster, a gesture more about intimidation than necessity. He approached her with deliberate steps, his face expressionless, yet radiating an air of authority that left little room for questioning. "Step away from the vehicle," he ordered sharply, ignoring her question. Serena blinked, taken aback by the harshness in his tone. She was accustomed to speaking with authority in her professional life, where she was respected and admired. But here, in this moment, she was nothing more than a suspect in the eyes of the officers. Trying to keep her composure, she slowly stepped away from the car, her hands still slightly raised. The weight of her pregnancy made her movements slow and cumbersome, but she didn't want to make any sudden gestures that could be misinterpreted. "What's the issue, officer?" Serena asked again, her voice calm but firm. "I'm just stopping to get gas." Adams gave her a once-over, his gaze cold and suspicious. "Whose car is this?" he asked bluntly, ignoring her question. Serena frowned, confused by the hostility. "It's mine. I'm Dr. Serena Walker. I live downtown, and I'm just on my way home." Officer Mitchell, who had been circling the car, glanced up at the mention of her name. "Dr. Walker, huh? What kind of doctor?" he asked, though his tone made it clear that he wasn't interested in the answer. Serena's patience was starting to wear thin. "I'm an OB/GYN. I work at the city hospital." "Look, officers, I don't understand why—" "Do you have any ID on you?" Adams interrupted, his tone more demanding now. Serena sighed and nodded, reaching into her bag carefully. "I'm going to reach into my bag now to get my ID," she said clearly, her voice calm but with an edge of frustration. She knew that even the smallest movement could be misinterpreted in these situations, and she had no intention of giving them any reason to escalate. She handed over her driver's license, her hand trembling slightly. Adams snatched it from her without a word, barely glancing at the name before looking back at her. "This is a nice car for someone driving through this part of town," he said, his voice dripping with insinuation. Serena felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but she bit it back. She was tired, pregnant, and just wanted to get home. "I'm a doctor. I've just come from a fundraiser for my charity." "There's nothing suspicious about that," she said, her voice more clipped now. Officer Mitchell, still circling the car, peered inside through the windows. "You got registration and insurance on this vehicle?" he called out. Serena felt her frustration growing. "Yes, of course. It's in the glove compartment. May I get it for you?" Adams stepped forward before she could move. "Stay right where you are," he snapped, grabbing her arm roughly. "We'll get it. Don't make any sudden moves." The sudden physical contact sent a shockwave of fear through Serena's body. She winced as Adam's grip tightened around her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "Officer, please! I'm 8 months pregnant," she protested, her voice shaking now with a mix of fear and disbelief. But Adams showed no sign of letting up. "That's not my problem. You cooperate, or we'll have to take you in," he said coldly. Serena's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She had done nothing wrong. She had complied with every demand. Yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. The weight of her unborn child pressed down on her, and she felt the first stirrings of pain in her lower abdomen, a contraction. "I don't understand what I've done wrong," Serena said, her voice strained now as the pain began to spread. Adams ignored her, roughly pulling her away from the car and shoving her towards the patrol vehicle. The sudden movement caused another sharp pain to shoot through her belly, and Serena gasped, clutching her stomach instinctively. "I'm pregnant!" she cried out, the pain and fear overwhelming her. But the officers didn't seem to care. Adams forced her against the hood of the patrol car, his hand pressing her head down as Mitchell moved to handcuff her. Serena's heart raced as her body was forced against the cold metal of the patrol car. The pressure on her belly made her feel lightheaded, and the pain in her abdomen was becoming unbearable. She tried to stay calm, tried to focus on breathing slowly, but every movement sent another jolt of agony through her body. Her mind screamed for her to stay focused, for the safety of her baby. "Please, I'm 8 months pregnant," Serena gasped, her voice now filled with desperation. "I'm not a threat. Let me sit down. I need help." But the officers, consumed by their own biases, seemed deaf to her pleas. Adams finished tightening the handcuffs around her wrists, yanking her arms behind her back, completely oblivious to her physical distress. Mitchell, standing nearby, looked unsure for a brief moment but did nothing to intervene. He had been conditioned to follow Adams' lead after years of working together. "I told you to cooperate," Adams sneered, giving her arm another hard tug. "This is what happens when people think they can break the law and get away with it." Serena's vision blurred as tears welled up in her eyes. She tried to hold back, knowing that crying or showing vulnerability might only encourage more aggression from the officers. But her body was rebelling against her. The intense pain was impossible to ignore. Another contraction ripped through her abdomen, more powerful than the last. The ground seemed to spin beneath her, and she barely managed to stay upright. "I need medical attention," Serena tried again, her voice cracking. "Please, I'm having contractions." Adams, seemingly indifferent, glanced down at her. "You'll get your medical attention at the station. Let's go." "Oh." But as Serena struggled to stand, it became clear that her condition was worsening. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air. Panic set in as she realized that she might be going into premature labor. Her baby was in danger. Mitchell, who had been silent for most of the encounter, finally stepped forward. "Adams, wait. She's not faking this. She really is in pain." His voice was hesitant, unsure of what to do next. Adams shot him a warning look. "She's just trying to stall. Don't fall for it." But Serena's cries grew louder as the contractions became more frequent. Mitchell hesitated again, the reality of the situation slowly dawning on him. "We can't just ignore this," Mitchell muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "She could lose the baby if we don't do something." Adams clenched his jaw, clearly irritated by his partner's sudden change of heart. But the sight of Serena writhing in pain on the ground finally made him pause. The fear of facing a serious medical emergency and potentially being held responsible for the consequences overcame his arrogance. With a deep sigh, Adams relented. "Fine. Call an ambulance." Mitchell wasted no time, quickly reaching for his radio to request medical assistance. The sirens that followed were a strange comfort to Serena, though she barely registered them through the fog of pain clouding her senses. When the paramedics arrived, they found Serena barely conscious, her body trembling from the stress and the contractions. One of the paramedics, a middle-aged man with a calm, reassuring demeanor, knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, we're going to help you. Just breathe for me, okay?" he said soothingly, as he and his partner prepared to move her onto a stretcher. "She's 8 months pregnant," Mitchell said, his voice quieter now, as if he were embarrassed by the whole situation. "She says she's having contractions." The paramedic shot a quick, disapproving glance at the officers before turning his full attention back to Serena. "We'll get you to the hospital right away. Just stay with us." Chapter 3. The Shocking Discovery. The emergency room was bustling with activity when Serena arrived, but she was immediately recognized by the staff. Her reputation as one of the leading OB-GYNs in the city preceded her, and within moments she was rushed into an examination room. Nurses and doctors swarmed around her, monitoring her condition and preparing for the possibility of an emergency delivery. As Serena's condition was stabilized, the hospital's staff began to whisper among themselves, piecing together what had happened. Word of the police encounter spread quickly, and the disbelief in the room was palpable. How could someone as respected and accomplished as Dr. Serena Walker be treated so brutally by the very people sworn to protect her? Outside the examination room, Officer Mitchell and Adams stood by awkwardly, waiting for news. Both men were visibly uncomfortable now, the weight of their actions slowly settling in. They had no idea who Serena was when they had stopped her, and now they were beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. A nurse, a tall woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude, emerged from the room, her face etched with disdain as she approached the officers. "Are you two the ones who brought her in?" she asked, her voice dripping with contempt. Mitchell cleared his throat, glancing at Adams before nodding. "Yes, we had to." The nurse cut him off with a cold glare. "That woman you attacked is Dr. Serena Walker. She's one of the top doctors in this hospital and a nationally recognized advocate for maternal health. She could have died. Her baby could have died because of you." "Oh." Adam's face drained of color as the nurse's words sank in. "Wait, what?" he stammered, his bravado completely shattered. She's a doctor?" The nurse crossed her arms, her gaze unrelenting. "Yes, and you're lucky she's stable now. If anything had happened to her or that baby, you'd both be looking at charges far worse than you can imagine." Mitchell, standing beside Adams, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found. "We didn't know who she was," he muttered, almost as if trying to excuse their behavior. "It doesn't matter who she is," the nurse snapped. "You shouldn't treat anyone like that. Pregnant women, black women. It shouldn't take someone being a doctor for you to show some basic human decency."
Oh.
Adams and Mitchell stood in stunned silence, the weight of their actions hitting them all at once. They had made a colossal mistake, and it was a mistake that wouldn't go unnoticed. Meanwhile, Serena's husband, Malcolm, arrived at the hospital, his face etched with worry. A civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on high-profile cases of racial injustice, Malcolm had been alerted to his wife's hospitalization only moments after she was brought in. When he entered her room, he was greeted by the sight of his wife lying on the hospital bed, pale and exhausted, but alive. Relief flooded through him, though his anger simmered just beneath the surface. "Serena, I'm here," he whispered, taking her hand gently. Serena opened her eyes slowly, her body still weak from the ordeal. "Malcolm," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. They hurt me. They didn't listen. Malcolm's jaw clenched tightly as he held her hand, his mind already racing with thoughts of what had to be done. He knew the officers would pay for this, but right now, all that mattered was Serena's recovery and the safety of their unborn child. "You're safe now," Malcolm said softly, though the fire in his eyes betrayed his calm tone. "I'm going to make sure they never do this to anyone else again." As Serena drifted back into a restless sleep, Malcolm stood and walked out of the room, his resolve solidifying with every step. Outside, he found the nurse who had confronted the officers earlier. "Can you tell me where the officers who brought my wife in are?" he asked, his voice calm but cold. The nurse nodded, her face tight with anger. "They're just down the hall. I already gave them a piece of my mind, but they're still waiting for news." Malcolm thanked her and walked toward the two officers, who stood nervously by the nurse's station. As soon as they saw him approaching, they straightened up, clearly sensing that this wasn't going to be a friendly encounter. Malcolm stopped a few feet away from them, his gaze piercing. "You two have no idea what you've done," he said quietly, his voice dangerously calm. "But I'm going to make sure you understand. You attacked my wife. You endangered the life of my unborn child. And now you're going to face the consequences." Adams opened his mouth to speak, but Malcolm cut him off with a glare. "Save your excuses. You'll have plenty of time to explain yourselves in court." The hospital hallway felt suffocating with tension, but Malcolm Walker was not one to be shaken easily. As a civil rights attorney, he had faced countless battles in court, but this one was personal. His wife, Dr. Serena Walker, was not just a victim. She was a symbol of the everyday injustices faced by Black Americans. And now, the story of what had happened to her would become a rallying cry for many. As soon as Malcolm left the hospital, he wasted no time in contacting his firm, instructing them to begin the legal proceedings. A lawsuit would be filed not only against the officers involved, but also against the police department and the city. He wanted accountability on every level. However, the situation had already begun to spiral beyond the realm of the courtroom. Within hours of the incident, word had leaked to the media, and by the following morning the headlines were ablaze. Pregnant black doctor attacked by police. City braces for backlash. The story spread like wildfire. The footage from the gas station's security cameras, which clearly showed Serena being dragged from her car and violently restrained, was leaked online, igniting a social media storm. Hashtags like #JusticeForSerena and #EndPoliceBrutality began trending as activists, celebrities, and the public expressed their outrage over the blatant disregard for Serena's life and the life of her unborn child. The media quickly picked up on the fact that Serena wasn't just any woman. She was a nationally recognized OB/GYN, someone who had been working tirelessly to improve maternal health care for women of color. Her story struck a chord with the masses, especially among communities already weary of systemic racism in policing. Meanwhile, protests erupted in cities across the country, with Serena's name becoming synonymous with the fight for racial justice. Crowds gathered outside police stations, courthouses, and city halls, holding signs that read, "Protect Black Women," "Justice for Dr. Serena Walker," "End Racial Profiling Now." The pressure was mounting, and city officials scrambled to address the situation. The police department, initially hoping to downplay the incident, was now caught in the middle of a growing storm. The police chief, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a weathered face, held a press conference to try to mitigate the damage. "This was an unfortunate misunderstanding," the chief said, standing at the podium in front of a sea of reporters. "The officers involved are under investigation, and we are cooperating fully with the district attorney's office." But the public wasn't buying it. The press conference only seemed to add fuel to the fire, especially when the chief refused to answer questions about whether the officers would face any disciplinary action or be placed on leave. Back at the hospital, Serena's condition had stabilized. She was still in pain, both physically and emotionally, but the danger to her pregnancy had passed for the moment. However, the trauma of the encounter left her shaken. Even though she had been through so much in her life, facing systemic barriers as a black woman in the medical field, this incident felt different. This attack had been on her dignity, her safety, and the life of her unborn child. Lying in the hospital bed, Serena watched the news coverage of her own story with a mix of disbelief and anger. She had always been careful, always played by the rules, thinking that her status and education would protect her from the ugliness of racial profiling. But now, it was painfully clear that no amount of success or respectability could shield her from the deep-rooted racism that ran through the veins of society. Malcolm, sitting beside her, squeezed her hand. "We're going to make them pay for this," he said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. Serena nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "This isn't just about us, Malcolm. This is about every woman like me who's been mistreated, ignored, or silenced. We have to fight not just for ourselves, but for them too." Malcolm smiled, his heart swelling with pride. His wife had always been strong, but now, in the face of this personal tragedy, she was determined to use her voice to make a difference on a larger scale. 2 weeks later, the lawsuit was filed. Malcolm Walker had prepared meticulously, using his team of top-tier attorneys and leveraging his connections in the civil rights community to ensure that this case would make waves across the nation. The lawsuit accused officers Adams and Mitchell of excessive force, racial profiling, and reckless endangerment of both Serena and her unborn child. The police department and the city were also named in the lawsuit for their failure to properly train officers and prevent racial bias from influencing policing. The courtroom was packed when the first hearing took place. Reporters, activists, and even politicians showed up to witness what was quickly becoming one of the most high-profile cases of the year. The energy in the room was electric, and the tension between the two sides was palpable. As the case unfolded, Malcolm took center stage. His opening statement was a masterclass in law and emotion, blending cold, hard facts with the undeniable pain his family had endured. He didn't just speak for Serena, He spoke for every black person who had ever been wrongfully targeted by law enforcement, for every pregnant woman whose life was put in danger because of negligence or violence, and for every person who had ever been silenced by systemic injustice. This case is not just about one woman's suffering, Malcolm said, his voice clear and unwavering. It is about a system that has allowed unchecked power and prejudice to run rampant for far too long. It is about accountability. It is about justice. And most importantly, it is about change. The courtroom was silent as his words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The officer's defense team, meanwhile, tried to paint a very different picture. They argued that the officers had no way of knowing who Serena was, that they had acted in the interest of public safety, and that Serena had not cooperated fully with their requests. It was a predictable defense, but one that was difficult to stomach in light of the overwhelming evidence. The gas station's security footage was played for the jury, showing Serena's peaceful compliance and the officer's unnecessary aggression. The footage was damning, but Malcolm didn't stop there. He brought in character witnesses, Serena's colleagues, patients, and even fellow doctors who testified to her integrity, her contributions to the community, and her impeccable reputation. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Serena herself took the stand. Dressed in a simple black dress, Serena walked slowly to the witness stand, her body still recovering from the physical trauma of the attack. She sat down, her hands resting gently on her lap as she looked out at the courtroom. The weight of the moment was heavy on her shoulders, but she was ready. Malcolm approached her, his face softening as he began his questioning. "Dr. Walker," he said gently, "can you describe what happened to you the night of the attack?" Serena took a deep breath before speaking. "I had just finished a fundraiser for my charity. I was on my way home when I stopped at a gas station because I needed fuel. That's when the officers approached me." She paused, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "They accused me of being suspicious, of stealing my own car. They didn't listen to anything I said. And when I told them I was pregnant, they ignored me. They pushed me, restrained me, and left me in so much pain I thought I would lose my baby." Her voice wavered for a moment, and the courtroom sat in complete silence, hanging on every word. "They treated me like I was nothing, like my life didn't matter. But it does, and so does the life of my child." The emotion in her words was undeniable. The jury, the judge, and even the spectators in the room seemed visibly moved by her testimony. As the case continued, the tension outside the courtroom mirrored the intensity inside. Protesters lined the streets, calling for justice not just for Serena, but for every person who had been wronged by the system. The case had become a symbol of the larger fight against police brutality, racial profiling, and the mistreatment of black women. In a surprise move, several prominent civil rights organizations announced their support for Serena's case, offering legal resources and media coverage to ensure that this wasn't just another case that faded into the background. This was becoming a watershed moment, and the public was watching closely. The morning of the final day of the trial dawned cold and gray, as if the weather itself could feel the weight of what was about to transpire. For days, the courtroom had been the center of national attention, and today it would be no different. Outside the courthouse, throngs of people gathered, holding signs demanding justice. News vans lined the street, and reporters huddled together, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the key players in this historic case. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was even more tense. Every seat in the courtroom was taken. Journalists, activists, supporters, and even legal scholars who had come to witness what had become a landmark case in the fight against racial profiling and police brutality. Malcolm Walker, standing tall in his sharp navy blue suit, exuded confidence as he prepared to deliver his final argument. His heart, however, was heavy with the personal toll this case had taken on his family. His wife, Serena, though strong and resilient, had endured unspeakable trauma. She was now in the final stages of her pregnancy, and despite the physical toll of the past months, she remained a beacon of courage. Across the courtroom, Officers Adams and Mitchell sat at the defense table, their expressions blank, but their tension was palpable. They had grown increasingly uneasy as the case progressed, watching their defense unravel under the weight of undeniable evidence. Their defense attorney, a well-known legal figure who had previously handled many police misconduct cases, had struggled to build a convincing case, and today was his last chance to salvage what remained of their defense. The defense's final attempt. As the courtroom quieted, the defense attorney rose from his seat and approached the jury. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and began his closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he started, his voice steady, but lacking the confidence that had characterized his earlier arguments. "I understand the emotion surrounding this case. What happened that night is tragic. No one disputes that. However, we must not let our emotions cloud our judgment of the facts." "Oh," he paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "My clients, Officers Adams and Mitchell, were simply doing their jobs. They were patrolling a high-crime area, and when they saw a vehicle they didn't recognize, driven by someone they believed to be acting suspiciously, they took action. They did not know who Dr. Serena Walker was at the time. They had no knowledge of her background, her profession, or the fact that she was pregnant." The defense attorney paced slowly in front of the jury, his hands clasped behind his back. In that moment, they believed they were dealing with a potential threat. Yes, mistakes were made, but these were not the actions of malicious individuals. They were the actions of officers trying to ensure public safety. His voice grew more earnest as he tried to appeal to the jurors' sense of reason. These men are not monsters. They did not wake up that morning intending to harm anyone. What happened was a tragic misunderstanding, a lapse in judgment under tense circumstances. But it does not rise to the level of criminal behavior. I ask you to consider this carefully when you deliberate. These men deserve fairness, just as any citizen would in a court of law. The defense attorney returned to his seat, his face betraying the knowledge that his words had likely done little to sway the jury. He glanced briefly at Adams and Mitchell, who sat stiffly, their hands folded tightly in front of them. Malcolm's closing argument. As Malcolm stood up to deliver his final argument, the room seemed to hold its breath. He walked slowly to the center of the courtroom, his gaze steady, his movements deliberate. He didn't need to rush. His words would carry the weight they needed to on their own. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Malcolm began, his voice calm but firm. "We are here today because my wife, Dr. Serena Walker, was treated with a level of violence, disregard, and disrespect that no human being should ever have to endure." He paused for a moment, letting the silence amplify the impact of his words before continuing. "This case is not about a misunderstanding. It's not about a momentary lapse in judgment. It's about the systemic issues that have plagued our society for far too long. Issues of bias, prejudice, and a deep-rooted belief in the inferiority of certain people based on the color of their skin." Malcolm began to walk slowly in front of the jury, his hands gesturing to punctuate his points. "My wife, Dr. Serena Walker, is a respected physician, a mother-to-be, a woman who has spent her life fighting to save the lives of others. And yet, on that night, she was not seen as any of those things. She was seen as a threat, not because of anything she did, but because of who she is, because of the color of her skin." The jurors watched him intently, the gravity of his words sinking in. "Officers Adams and Mitchell didn't just fail to protect my wife that night, they actively endangered her. They ignored her pleas for help. They dismissed her when she told them she was pregnant. They used excessive force when none was needed, and they nearly caused her to lose the life of our child." Malcolm's voice wavered slightly, the emotion of the moment catching up with him, but he quickly regained his composure. "This case is about more than just my wife. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that those who wield power in our society are held responsible for their actions. It's about making sure that no one, no woman, no black person, no mother, has to fear for their life when encountering those who are supposed to protect them." He turned to face the jury directly, his eyes locking with each member of the panel. "Today, you have the power to send a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. that our society will no longer turn a blind eye to injustice, and that every life, no matter the color of their skin, is worth protecting. Malcolm returned to his seat, the courtroom so quiet that the only sound was the faint rustling of papers from the court clerk's desk. He had said everything that needed to be said. The jury deliberates. As the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Outside, the streets were filled with protesters, holding signs and chanting slogans in support of Serena and the fight for justice. The national media continued to cover the trial, with live reports coming in from every major network. Inside the courthouse, Serena sat beside Malcolm, her hand resting on her belly. The baby had moved several times during the trial, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Malcolm leaned over and kissed her hand gently, whispering, "We did everything we could. Now it's in their hands." The jury deliberated for hours, and as the day wore on, the tension only grew. Reporters speculated on what the long deliberation meant. Were the jurors divided? Was there a holdout? Inside the deliberation room, the jurors debated the evidence, the testimony, and the closing arguments. Some were moved by the defense's plea for understanding, but the majority were swayed by the undeniable facts of the case. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom late in the afternoon, the air was thick with anticipation. The judge called the court to order, and the foreman of the jury stood to deliver the verdict. The room was silent, the only sound the faint clicking of pens and the soft murmur of reporters preparing to take notes. In the matter of Dr. Serena Walker versus Officers Adams and Mitchell, the foreman began, his voice steady but solemn. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty of excessive force, reckless endangerment, and racial profiling." A collective gasp filled the room, followed by murmurs of approval from the supporters gathered in the gallery. Serena closed her eyes, a wave of relief washing over her as she realized that justice had been served. Malcolm squeezed her hand tightly, his face a mixture of pride and emotion. The judge turned to the officers, his face stern. "Officers Adams and Mitchell, you have been found guilty of serious charges. Your actions endangered the life of a woman and her unborn child. This court finds your conduct to be a gross violation of your duties as police officers, and you will be held accountable." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before delivering the sentence. "You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in state prison, and you will each pay a civil penalty for the damages caused by your actions." The courtroom erupted in a flurry of activity. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Activists embraced one another, and outside the courthouse, the crowds cheered in celebration. The chants of "Justice for Serena" rang out through the streets, a powerful reminder that change, though slow, was possible. The aftermath. As Serena and Malcolm left the courthouse, they were met with a throng of reporters, all eager to hear their reaction to the verdict. Serena, though tired and still recovering from the physical and emotional toll of the past months, stood tall as she addressed the crowd. "This victory is not just mine," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This is a victory for every woman, every person of color, who has ever been mistreated, ignored, or silenced by those in power. This is a step toward accountability, but it is only one step. We still have so much work to do to ensure that no one else has to endure what I went through." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the crowd, her hand resting gently on her belly. "Today I stand not just for myself, but for my child. I stand for the future, and I promise you I will continue to fight for justice, for equality, and for the dignity of all people." The crowd erupted in applause, and as Serena and Malcolm walked away, hand in hand, they knew that this was just the beginning of a larger fight. But for now, they had won a victory that would resonate for years to come. The days following the trial's conclusion passed in a whirlwind of emotions for Serena and Malcolm. They had won a significant battle, but as they quickly realized, the war for justice and equality was far from over. Every headline, every news report reminded them of the larger fight ahead. Serena spent the first few days after the verdict at home, physically drained from the pregnancy and the emotional toll the trial had taken on her. Though she had emerged victorious in the courtroom, she felt anything but triumphant. The constant media attention made it difficult for her to find peace. Reporters camped outside their house, eager for a statement or a candid photograph. She couldn't step outside without feeling the weight of the public eye on her shoulders. At night, Serena struggled to sleep. Each time she closed her eyes, she was back at the gas station, the flashing lights of the patrol car burning into her memory. She could still feel the officer's hands on her, the cold pavement beneath her, and the overwhelming fear that her baby might not survive the encounter. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was a reality she had lived through, and the trauma of it clung to her, refusing to let go. Malcolm, too, was dealing with the aftermath in his own way. Though he had won the case, securing justice for his wife, he found little solace in the victory. He had spent years as a civil rights attorney, fighting for the rights of others, but this time had been different. This time, it was his family that had been attacked. His wife, the woman he loved, had been treated as less than human. And while the officers had been held accountable, the larger system that allowed such abuses to continue remained intact. One evening, as Serena sat quietly by the window, watching the sun set over their neighborhood, Malcolm approached her with a glass of water and sat down beside her. "You've been quiet all day," he said gently, placing his hand on her shoulder. Serena nodded, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "Even though we won the trial, it doesn't feel like enough. Those officers are going to prison, but the system that created them, the system that allowed them to treat me that way, is still out there." "Oh." Malcolm nodded in agreement, his expression somber. "It's true. This was just one case, one victory. But there are thousands more just like it, and most of them don't get the attention yours did." Serena turned to look at him, her eyes filled with resolve. "We need to do more, Malcolm. I want to use my voice, my platform, to help other women, other mothers, who have been through what I've been through. We can't let this end with me. We have to keep fighting." Malcolm squeezed her hand, a sense of pride welling up inside him. Despite everything she had been through, Serena remained as strong and determined as ever. "I'll be right beside you," he said quietly. "Whatever you need, I'm with you." The following week, Serena and Malcolm sat down to discuss their next steps. They had already begun receiving offers from various advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and media outlets, all eager to hear from Serena. But they knew that simply giving interviews or attending rallies wouldn't be enough to create lasting change. They needed to do something bigger, something that would make a real impact. Malcolm suggested forming a foundation, an organization dedicated to fighting for the rights of women of color, particularly in the areas of maternal health, criminal justice, and police reform. It would be a way to continue their work, not just in response to what had happened to Serena, but in service of a much larger cause. "We could call it the Walker Foundation," Malcolm suggested, his voice filled with excitement as they brainstormed ideas late into the night. "It could be a nonprofit that focuses on advocacy, education, and policy reform. We'd offer legal support to women who've been wrongfully targeted, and we could partner with healthcare providers to improve maternal care for women of color." "Oh!" Serena's eyes lit up at the idea. It was exactly what she had been thinking, a way to turn her personal experience into a force for good. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with hope for the first time in weeks. "And we could hold workshops, provide training for police officers on racial bias, and create a network of support for women who need it." Over the next several months, Serena and Malcolm worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life. They partnered with civil rights attorneys, healthcare professionals, and community leaders to lay the foundation for what would become a powerful voice in the fight for justice and equality. As they worked to build the organization, they began receiving stories from women across the country. Women who had faced discrimination, violence, and neglect at the hands of the police or the healthcare system. Each story fueled their resolve to keep going, to fight harder. Despite the emotional toll the work took on them, Serena and Malcolm knew that they were making a difference. Their foundation quickly gained national attention, and donations poured in from supporters who believed in their mission. Serena became a sought-after speaker at conferences, rallies, and media appearances, sharing her story and advocating for change. Meanwhile, Serena's recovery. While Serena was pouring her energy into the foundation, she couldn't ignore the toll that the past months had taken on her health, both physical and emotional. Her pregnancy was entering its final stages, and her doctor had advised her to take things easy, reminding her that stress could have a negative impact on both her and the baby. One night, after a particularly long day of meetings and planning sessions, Serena collapsed onto the couch, her body aching with exhaustion. Malcolm sat beside her, concern etched on his face. "You need to rest, Serena," he said softly. "The foundation is important, but so is your health and the baby's health. We can't afford to lose you." Serena nodded, knowing he was right, but she struggled to let go of the sense of urgency she felt. "I just don't want to stop," she admitted. "I feel like if I slow down, all of this, everything we're fighting for, will lose momentum." Malcolm reached out and took her hand, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to do it all at once. The foundation is strong, and it will continue even if you take some time to focus on yourself. You've already done so much. Now, you need to take care of you and our baby." For the first time in a while, Serena allowed herself to truly relax. She leaned into Malcolm, feeling the warmth and safety of his embrace. "You're right," she whispered. "I'll take a break, but only for a little while." And with that, Serena finally allowed herself to rest, knowing that the fight for justice would still be there when she was ready to return. The impact of the Walker case spread far and wide, far beyond the confines of their local community. As news outlets across the country continued to report on the verdict and the subsequent activism spearheaded by Serena and Malcolm, the couple found themselves at the heart of a growing movement for systemic change. In the months following the trial, several states introduced legislation aimed at addressing racial bias in policing. These proposed reforms included mandatory training programs focused on de-escalation tactics, implicit bias awareness, and the use of non-lethal methods in confrontational situations. While some police unions pushed back, arguing that these reforms would make it harder for officers to do their jobs, public opinion was overwhelmingly in favor of change. One of the key reforms that emerged from the Walker case was the nationwide push for body camera mandates. Serena and Malcolm had worked closely with lawmakers to ensure that officers would be required to wear body cameras during all interactions with the public, ensuring that incidents like what happened to Serena would be captured and held accountable. Serena, invited to testify before Congress, stood before the packed chamber, her voice calm and clear as she delivered her testimony on the need for police reform. She spoke not only from personal experience, but from the perspective of a mother, a doctor, and an advocate for justice. "The trauma I endured was not an isolated incident," she told the members of Congress. "It's part of a pattern, one that disproportionately affects Black and brown people across this country. We must act now to address these issues, not just to prevent future tragedies, but to build a system that truly protects and serves all citizens, regardless of race or background." Her words resonated with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, and soon after, the Serena Walker Police Accountability Act was introduced in several states. The bill called for independent investigations into all cases of police misconduct, the implementation of body camera programs, and the creation of civilian oversight boards to review complaints against officers. Media attention and public perception. As Serena and Malcolm continued their work with the foundation and lawmakers, the media kept a close eye on their progress. News segments and talk shows frequently invited them to speak, and Serena found herself becoming a leading voice in the movement for police reform. Her poise, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to justice endeared her to many, and she quickly became a symbol of hope for those fighting similar battles. But with the increased visibility came increased scrutiny. Serena and Malcolm faced criticism from some corners, particularly from law enforcement advocates who viewed their efforts as an attack on the police. They received hate mail and online harassment, with some accusing them of using Serena's ordeal for personal gain or political leverage. Serena struggled with the negativity at times, but Malcolm was always there to remind her why they were doing this work. People are always going to resist change, especially when it challenges their power, Malcolm told her one night after she had read through a particularly hurtful email. But we're not doing this for them. We're doing it for the people who don't have a voice, who've been silenced or ignored. That's who we're fighting for. And so, despite the backlash, Serena pressed on. The Walker Foundation grew rapidly, expanding its reach across the country. Their team of legal experts, doctors, and activists provided support to families who had been affected by police violence and healthcare discrimination. And the foundation became a national leader in the fight for maternal health equity and criminal justice reform. The Walker Foundation's first major victory. One of the foundation's first major successes came when they took on the case of Maya Johnson, a young black woman who had been wrongfully arrested during a routine traffic stop. Maya, who was 5 months pregnant at the time, had been subjected to similar treatment as Serena, pushed to the ground and handcuffed without cause. The incident had left her traumatized, and like Serena, she had feared for the safety of her unborn child. With the help of the Walker Foundation, Maya's case went to court, and she won a significant settlement from the police department. But more than the financial compensation, Maya's case helped set a precedent for how pregnant women and women of color should be treated by law enforcement. "It's not just about me," Maya said during a press conference after the verdict. "It's about every woman who has been mistreated, who has been told that her life doesn't matter. Thanks to Serena and Malcolm, I got justice. And now I want to help others get the same." The victory bolstered the Walker Foundation's credibility and influence, and soon they were taking on more cases, helping women across the country fight back against injustice. The day Serena gave birth to their daughter was a day of joy and relief, a culmination of all the fear, hope, and love that had carried them through the storm. The baby, a healthy, beautiful girl, came into the world with a loud cry, filling the room with life and promise. Serena, exhausted but overjoyed, cradled her daughter in her arms, tears of happiness streaming down her face. Malcolm stood beside her, his own eyes glistening with emotion as he kissed Serena's forehead and gazed down at their child. "Grace," Serena whispered, the name they had chosen for their daughter. "Welcome to the world, my sweet girl." In that moment, everything felt right. After all the pain, the fear, and the struggle, they had made it. Their family was whole, and the future, though uncertain, was full of hope. Continuing the fight. Even after Grace's birth, Serena and Malcolm didn't slow down. Their mission, to create a better world for their daughter and for all children, continued to drive them forward. The Walker Foundation expanded its reach even further, opening offices in several states and partnering with national organizations to tackle issues of racial injustice, police reform, and healthcare inequity. Serena balanced her work as a mother with her role as a leader in the foundation. Though she had scaled back some of her public appearances, she remained deeply involved in the organization's day-to-day operations, mentoring young activists, working with lawmakers, and continuing to speak out on behalf of those who had been silenced. As the years went by, Serena's legacy only grew. She was invited to speak at international conferences on human rights and became a leading voice in the global movement for racial justice. Her work with the Walker Foundation earned her numerous awards, but it was never the recognition that mattered to Serena. It was the change she saw happening around her, the new policies, the lives saved, the families supported, that fueled her passion. Grace's future. As Grace grew older, she became more aware of the work her parents were doing. By the time she was 5, she was already asking questions about the marches and protests she saw on TV. And Serena and Malcolm took great care to explain the importance of standing up for what's right. "One day, Grace, you'll understand just how much we fought for you," Serena would tell her daughter as they watched the news together. "But until then, Just know that everything we're doing is for your future, and for the future of all children like you. Grace would nod, her young mind absorbing the weight of her mother's words, even if she didn't fully understand them yet. But one thing was certain. She was growing up in a world that was better than the one Serena had faced. And for Serena, that was the greatest victory of all. The end.